Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of the magazine, and with me today are Mark McCaffrey, Mark DeSantis, and Murray Dahm, the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare. And today we're going to discuss in this last episode of 2023, one of probably the most long anticipated episodes or editions of the magazine, 16.6. About Alexander the Great. We finally gone and done it after ending last volume issue 15.6. So ending volume 15 on Macedonia rising and the rise of the rise of the kingdom and Philip II. We now get to his son, and we're looking at the early phase of his great campaign, the invasion of Persia. We may have accidentally skipped sort of the bit in between where he consolidates the kingdom and goes north for a bit, although we've had an article about that. We've had articles about Alexander the Great in the past, so here and there, though not that many. It's the first time we actually dedicated a whole issue to him. And oddly enough, we only have very few questions for this podcast, but I have no doubt that we will be able to fill an hour or so without any trouble whatsoever.
There's no more questions about Alexander because we've actually answered them all.
It's possible, Murray. But I think with a 60-page magazine, of which not 60 pages are dedicated to Alexander the Great, we can publish many more issues before we've answered all the questions. But let's just start with the one question we had, which sort of predates that invasion, from chairman. I'm not sure what chairman of, but understanding that Alexander had to secure his new position as king of Macedon after the murder of Philip. How close was his father to starting the invasion of Persia? Who wants to take a punt?
I would say that Philip probably is himself not that far off an invasion. I mean, he's already sent across Parmenion with an advanced force over across the Hellespont by that stage, even whilst he's sort of celebrating a marriage festival and parading himself as one of the 12 Olympian gods, etc. He's already got men across in Asia, supposedly doing quite well, making their way down the western seaboard, having victories over local Persian satraps. But those victories come to a bit of an end within the first year. So whether that's to do with the change of leadership back in Macedon, or whether that is simply the Persians doing their usual thing of being a little bit slow to sort of react to a military incursion, is up for grabs, because of course we've got this problem whereby a lot of our sources will focus. I guess it's more of a problem with Alexander, but also with Philip, that we've got the sources predominantly focusing on the key figure, the king. And so the campaigns of figures like Parmenion, and Parmenion is one who sort of, he doesn't really get the limelight with the historians, but he's out there acting for both Philip and then later for Alexander, actually taking independent campaigns in Asia, and then further down when they get into eventually Syria and whatnot. He's out there, and he's probably not the only one undertaking expeditions on behalf of the king, but we don't really get the great detail for it. So what he does, how much he's successful, whether his success is rebuffed by Persian success or his own failure, we don't really get the idea. We're all focused on, of course, Philip at the time back in Macedon.
Yeah, it's interesting that Parmenion does get given credit for the Crocus Fields and other battles earlier, but there's not really any, other than the fact that he's around. It's like, why are we crediting Parmenion with that when Parmenion goes over to Anatolia, he's successful, but not devastatingly so. He's no Alexander. And I think the interesting thing with Philip, I agree that probably he wasn't that far off invading. All of the pieces were in place, but as a predominantly infantry general, would he have had the success that Alexander had as a predominantly cavalry general? But because he had the infantry commanded by Philip's commanders, they did what they did, and he could be free to run amok with his cavalry. And the interesting thing would be that what Philip probably would have done was that he would have left Alexander as heir apparent in charge in Greece, just as he'd left him in Macedonia and Pella when he'd gone to Byzantium. And so therefore Alexander would not have been on campaign with Philip in Asia. And so it would have had a very different appearance if Philip had gone, I think.
The sticking point for Philip, of course, is that he has sort of spent most of his career unifying Macedon, and that has included big changes in terms of what might be considered Lower and Upper Macedon, and actually bringing what had been previously the separate dynasts of the other cantons into subservience to the Argead throne as such, and whether he'd actually be forthcoming in, putting himself into a big campaign in Asia, or whether he'd be, the scope of his reach and his ambition in Asia would have been probably influenced to a heavy extent by the internal politics of Macedon at the time. And I don't think by the time that Alexander gets to it, the situation has changed in Macedon. There is the old guard moving out, the new guard moving in, which has incorporated many of those previous, dynastic families into what is now going to be a much more cohesive Macedonian force. And so therefore it allows Alexander to undertake a much larger, longer campaign away.
Yeah. Not to mention raising Thebes, I think, is a massive step for Alexander, because by raising such an ancient city, it shows how incredibly harsh the punishment will be for turning against him. And that keeps Greece pliant pretty much right through until Alexander's death. And then you get the Lamian War and others. But, the fact is that Alexander shows, if you turn against me, I will destroy you. And that in a way Philip, he probably learned that lesson, but he's nowhere near as harsh as that Philip that we know of. He doesn't quite do the same level of devastation, I suppose. And the other thing, of course, is that the diplomatic victories of Philip, would they have had the same effect? He's not as rich as the Persian satraps, the Persian Empire. So the whole turning cities against Athens wouldn't necessarily have had the same impact that he had in Greece. But guaranteed he would have tried all of those methods and technologies that he'd already done in unifying Greece.
He might have actually been a little bit more. Alexander, of course, goes on the expedition with the great propaganda cell of, we're doing this for Greece, we're taking the revenge mode to take revenge on the Persians for what they did back in the heyday of Greece. But of course, then he changes halfway through his campaigns eventually to, I'm the great king of Asia, and I'm going to show my greatness through conquest. How Philip would have sold a campaign, that would have been quite interesting, because if you look at his, like you say, his previous tactics, the idea of actually extending the hand through marriage alliances, through bringing, like I said previously, bringing those other elements of the Greater Balkans into alliance with Macedon, through actually incorporating them into the aristocratic circles and the companions, etc. Would that have come in sooner than Alexander did, in terms of Philip moving into Asia Minor and dealing with the satraps there? It's a question.
Well, I think Philip was a better diplomat than Alexander was.
Alexander being the proverbial hammer who thinks that everything is a nail.
Occasionally, yeah. Okay.
If I hit that nail harder, the other nails will just push themselves in, which is, what you can see at Tyre and, absolutely. Yeah.
What can we say about what Parmenion, how much detail do we have for Parmenion's campaign?
A paragraph, maybe? Hang on, here's my Arian. Oh, look at that. I prepared it earlier. It's not a lot. I think Mark's exactly right, that the focus is on Alexander and the focus is on Philip. Even Justin, the epitome that we've got is the Philippic history. It's interesting, the sort of echoes, because of course we've got the original Philippics of the speeches, which firstly abuse Philip as this great tyrant and this great threat, but then call on Philip to be the leader of Greece. That earlier in the 5th century and late 5th century and early 4th century, it's Sparta, then it's Thebes, then it's Athens. And then it's like, oh, but now it's Macedon because you're clearly the one who's in control. I mean, my favorite phrase from Isocrates is, the need for persuasion no longer exists, which is written in the aftermath of the Battle of Chaeronea. It's like, yeah, you're it. You won. You smashed the place. You get to do what you like. But, why don't you go and conquer Asia? That whole idea of Philip's, the sort of the spectre of Philip, I suppose. I think there's even a book called The Spectre of Philip, is a fascinating one because, even Cicero's Philippics are named after the speeches against Philip. They're not the Antoninics because that would just be horrific to try and call them that. So, there's so much the image of who Philip was and what he represented present in later history. It's a fascinating sort of aspect of Philip's long reach, if you like.
I think we also get, there's a significant part of that little bit about Parmenion and what he's actually doing in the advance movement is actually being mentioned for the reason that we have Philip's death and then we have the speculation over, what is to happen next in the quick politics of, succession race of Alexander seeking to establish his claim to the throne and then seeking to consider who could possibly move against him and whatnot. And of course, that then brings the idea of, well, you've got these potential threats to Alexander and the throne in this advanced party. So therefore, if it wasn't for that, the examination of the threat there, maybe we wouldn't actually even have what we have on Parmenion and his movements.
I mean, because there's an army sitting there, and what is the army going to do? Yeah.
Well, it's that, and you've got Alexander's most recent father-in-law, Philip's most recent father-in-law, who has joined Parmenion on campaign and is the potential threat of, has he got an army that might be loyal to him, etc. It's why the army gets mentioned.
That's fascinating. But I think also Parmenion, there's the idea of the advice before Granicus. And as the article by Nick Secunda in the issue points out, we've got the problem in the Battle of the Granicus of advice to Alexander not to attack, but to camp and attack in the morning. And it's given to Parmenion. And it's ignored in the accounts of Plutarch and Arrian, and he attacks immediately and crosses the river. And then you've got this bizarre alternate version in Diodorus where they attack in the morning and the battle isn't, in fact, across the river, it's across the other side of the river. And what Secunda does is he basically revives the idea of Robin Lane Fox from 1973, a controversial idea that got eliminated in the second edition of his biography of Alexander. That, in fact, there are two battles of the Granicus, the one on the evening before, which may, in fact, have been a defeat, and then the one in the following morning, which is a victory. And so what we find...
Or an initial skirmish, and
yeah. And then we have the two combined into one battle, which is a way of making those two sources make sense together. But it's a tricky one because the image of Alexander in Plutarch and Arrian is headstrong, impetuous, rash, absolutely brave. But the thing for me is that the idea that he gets to the Granicus and attacks immediately against overwhelming enemy positions basically nullifies everything that the Macedonian war machine has been built towards.
Yeah, but having said that, the Macedonian war machine has been financially run into the ground by this stage. And so you can take the opinion that maybe he is thinking that I need a tactical victory here to actually be able to, one, fund any campaign from this point on. I need a victory. I need some spoils. I need also to sell it to my troops that we're not going to be running out of funds and they are going to lose faith in the campaign. And for a young king who's just on the throne to lose the loyalty of the old guard who have stayed loyal to him after Philip, but also the new guard who he's trying to establish.
It's tricky though. I mean, but you don't then do that by throwing away everything that the Macedonian tactics have been building towards. And when we then get the Issus and Gaugamela, he He absolutely, and the account of Diodorus, it's absolutely infantry. You go here, you hold them, I'll go to the right, there'll be a gap, and then I'll charge at the gap. And that's what he does for 3 battles. The idea that he wouldn't do that and wouldn't utilize the old guard who are in command of the tactics, the taxace of the phalanx, is very odd, but it sort of suits a picture of Alexander, this sort of romanticized great king, which becomes, the Hellenistic kings have to lead their cavalry from the front. That's the model of kingship that Alexander introduces. And I came across a passage the other day about Phocion, who's a Athenian commander at the end of that 4th century, who has a admonishment of himself, saying when an enemy arrow lands at his feet, how foolish he's been to endanger his own life, by getting that close to the front. So it's a very interesting early switch, because we normally think of it as a later development, that Roman commanders, for instance, are not in the front line until, things are desperate, that they're behind the troops. And so it's interesting to hear an Athenian commander in the 4th century saying, I shouldn't be endangering myself because I'm more important as a commander to the city than as an individual soldier in the front line. Whereas when you go back and you look at the Persian wars, the Peloponnesian War, and Alexander, the commander is absolutely in the front.
But you're also entering into the realms of tropes being established by Roman writers who were relying upon for this whole period, and we've got nothing from the, barely anything, a couple of scraps from the period itself. So therefore, you've got 1st century Roman writers who are very interested in the ideas that may have been thrown up in their more recent history of the likes of certain Roman commanders being hamstrung in making independent decisions by being guided in their decisions by the collective Senate, like Pompey was, for example, and then that sort of being imposed upon the situations that Alexander finds himself in with his old guard, or, for example, later on at the Battle of Issus, or before Issus, I should say, that Darius finds himself in, where he's trying to establish his position east of the mountains in the Syrian plains, waiting for Alexander there, and then coming under pressure from his court to move on the advance, take the offensive, and as opposed to the at the time Greek Greek mercenary hoplites, and possibly the Macedonian exile Amyntas, saying, no, stay here, we've got tactical advantage. And of course, the pressure of the voices around him fogs the judgment of the commander. Are we looking at the Roman author's voice more than what's really happening on the ground?
For me, Darius getting behind Alexander on his advance past Issus to the Syrian gates is a victory. He's cut off the advance of Alexander in Asia. He has got behind him, cut off his line of supply, cut off his line of communication. Yes, Alexander's got a fleet, but if he had to rely on the fleet itself alone, he's in a really precarious position. So that idea of moving from the plain into Issus is painted as a mistake.
Great way to force a battle.
I think that's not a victory, because I think he's missed his victory, because he was aiming at a victory there, but he doesn't get what he's aiming at, because I think he's not trying to cut him off. He's trying to cut Parmenion and Alexander in half, I think.
Which he achieves. He then loses the subsequent battle. But the fact that he interposes himself and his 600,000 men, according to the sources, at that point on Alexander's advance, who's moved past him, that's a brilliant tactical success. Yes, it's all nullified by Issus, where he runs away and loses an army, but the fact that he gets behind him.
But that's only if Alexander is not going to force an immediate conflict. I mean, if he's behind him and he's cutting off those supplies, then he's got to extend the campaign, but he doesn't.
What immediately happens after it absolutely affects it. But the fact that he steals a march on Alexander is told he's in the proximity, and he then somehow cuts behind Alexander, who doesn't know where he is exactly. He's told he's coming, and Alexander marches south. He then cuts him off. It's brilliant. And then everything subsequent to it is awful. But if it was a weekly update, if it was a modern war where we're getting, what happened in the war today, on Tuesday, amazing. Alexander has been cut off in Asia, the great king with 600,000 men. Don't forget, Alexander hasn't fought Darius yet. He's only fought the satraps. Definitely the war is over. Alexander's stuffed. He's cut in half. It's all gone. Wednesday night, different story. But Tuesday night, Darius is winning.
You could also say it's a way to make Alexander's victory yet more impressive, because he manages to grab back the initiative and turn the tables on Darius.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, we don't have a Persian perspective of the wars. We've got, only, again, the old stereotype of winners write history. We've got Alexander's version. And again, coming back to Parmenion was successful. He'd made a foothold in Persian territory. That's great. But it's then superseded by what Alexander achieves much faster. And similarly, the idea that Darius, interestingly, that idea that he flees twice, both at Issus and Gaugamela, is he's more important than the army. And if he survives, he can raise a new army. And he, according to the sources, he raises 1 million men for the Battle of Gaugamela. But
it's interesting in terms of him fleeing at Issus that he actually causes that defeat, really, in terms of, if you look at where then certain elements of his army then subsequently flee when the army breaks, there seems to be the suggestion that some of the Greek mercenaries actually flee south. So they've actually broken through part of that line. They're actually fleeing past Alexander's position. So therefore, if Darius wouldn't have fled, then there's a very big chance that actually that battle would have turned around on itself, possibly.
When he flees, he gives everyone else precedence to flee. I fled, you can flee too.
I also find it amazing that they're, looking at it, they're literally using, you've spoken already about Alexander's grand tactic that he uses over and over again. And yet Issus is the battle where both Alexander and Darius are both using the exact same tactic. They're both going for heavy cavalry on one flank, which they're planning to break and then turn on the anvil. And it's Alexander who manages to do it. Alexander's left flank is held in terms of the cavalry, even despite massing of the Persian cavalry on their right flank, on the seaward flank. It's held by the Peloponnesian cavalry, etc. And Alexander gets through. But and yet he's the one known for this move.
Absolutely, and I think it's a fascinating aspect of Alexander that's not really explored, because the genius of the battles, and I mean, he does lead from the front. That he's that model of leadership you get today of follow me, don't go where I tell you, which is Darius, or come with me. Those three models of leadership. So in a way, the servile nature of Persian warfare, of Darius at the back going, go and do this, as opposed to Alexander saying, follow me. And, the stories and the mosaic of Alexander getting within a spear's cast of Darius himself. Again, when you look at the 300 movie with Leonidas throwing his spear and hitting the cheek of Xerxes, that's the Alexander model of leadership. I don't know that he was aiming to kill the king. If he'd killed Darius, would they have fled? I think the fact is that Darius flees, they flee. But if Darius died, would they have put up more of a fight? Don't know.
I don't know. If you look at many other battles where there's even a rumor of the general dying, then
Alexander's personal, leadership style, where he leads from the front, it paid dividends in the sense that he would always go for the decapitation strike. He would go after the enemy general, the king, and if he could defeat that person, he relied on the defeat of that person to cause the rest of the enemy to flee. So in that regard, he was not taking as many casualties by having to get into a gigantic slugging match. On the other hand, he himself personally exposed himself to terrible dangers. I mean, I think he almost dies at Granicus. He's wounded several times later on during his campaign. He was a shadow of himself after all of the various wounds he took over the course of 11 years. So there were benefits to his style, but there are obviously many deep drawbacks.
And he's also influenced there, of course, by the model of his father, that Philip also in the front infantry, not cavalry, but he takes severe wounds. Obviously the axe to the eye, and Alexander saves his life. And again, we have Clytus and others saving Alexander's life. So it's almost though that there's that pattern of, if you're in danger in battle, the opportunity for people to save your life is present. And that model again extends into the medieval period.
And it must be cultural too. That is, the Macedonians, for example, were their leaders were very much lead from the front kind of warriors, whereas among the Romans, at least the Romans of the late Republican period and the imperial period, it was not expected that generals were supposed to lead from the front. So, for example, it was considered to be extraordinary when Maximinus Thrax in the early 3rd century fought in the front line, and whereas that was not necessarily something that earlier Roman generals were supposed to do, and he was an emperor. So perhaps once again, the cultural expectations of the soldiers, the men who were supposed to go into battle, some of them probably expected their general to lead in battle, and maybe they, or even if they didn't expect it, maybe they drew some sort of morale sustenance from that.
Well, you've got to consider that Alexander is in charge of a Macedonia that is relatively in its infancy as a real force in the ancient world. It is coming from these what we could really call hill clans, who there would be that leadership personality that would be dominant because of the immediacy of it. I think Alexander's also fostering a cult of personality, and it's the propaganda war that he's winning. And you can see that even before Issus, with him and Darius exchanging blows as such, and the fostering of this image is coming through the propagation of stories like him and the illness that he suffers, and actually, the warning that he receives from Parmenion, don't trust your doctor Philippus, he's going to kill you, and the whole, I will trust the men I trust and I will take them, etc. It's being put out there for a very good reason.
Well, even the visiting of Troy and the cutting of the Gordian knot are all about projecting an image. And Siwa, obviously, by then he's been massively successful, but that Heraclean kind of imagery he's putting forth is absolutely part of it. But it's an interesting one where, you've got this precedent of putting yourself in danger and leading from the front. And interestingly, when you look at the Theban, Spartan, Athenian model of the leader is indeed in the front on the right and is just one of the men rather than superlative, leading from the front. They are in the front and they are in the ranks, but that idea of being better at fighting from, horseback. And you get that in the Xenophon's Cavalry Commander, for instance, 350-ish, where he's saying, 360-ish, he's dead by 350, that the cavalry commander should be better than all of his men at the things he's asking his men to do. And again, when we look at 2023, those models of leadership are still in management books today, leading from the front versus leading from behind, and all those sorts of ideas. I just want to point out, of course, that 2023 is some bizarre anniversary of Alexander, who died in 323. It's not an exact number, but there's 23 in both of them. So the 2000 something and 46th anniversary.
Don't break your brain, especially with the switching calendars. it's still, he plays a very high stakes game, because the more emphasis there is on his personality, the more the risk for, Macedonia as a whole. I mean, if he dies in battle, it's no longer his problem, but the army and the state might be in great peril. And you could argue that as for commanding the battle goes, I mean, he takes charge of his unit and he goes and does what he does, but he is completely relinquishes control over everything else and has to depend on the other commanders to do what they agreed beforehand, presumably.
If he had died, his campaign dies with him.
It's an interesting one in terms of him sort of at this stage tagging along Alexander Lynkestis as well, because he gets stuck around for a while, and one idea is that maybe he's being tagged along as a spare, just in case. In terms of,
Harry.
Yeah, okay. All that's left of the Macedonian dynasties that have been, decimated by Alexander coming to the throne. So is that, a reflection of, trying to placate the aristocracy, saying at least we've got something left if, we're reckless?
And with Alexander in his heroic leadership mode taking direct part in the battle, that actually did have a tactical drawback, in the sense that when Parmenio's left wing at Gaugamela was under heavy pressure from the Persians, they had to actually go find Alexander locked in battle, who was ready to go pursue Darius and hopefully get Darius and kill Darius, or at least capture him. But they had to drag him back to come help Parmenio's left wing. And that itself was difficult because Alexander was very far away. Had Alexander been in a more central location, they could have deployed something, reserves, or at least somehow shifted troops around in a much more economical fashion. Once Alexander was committed, he was committed, and he lost control of the overall battle, which is something that maybe like a someone deployed behind the lines, like a Roman general, wouldn't have suffered from as much.
And yet, I don't think we've discussed this very much before, but just to contradict what I just said myself, we could probably have a debate about commanding armies and commanding in battle in the ancient world. Anyway, to what degree can a commander really influence a battle once it's underway? Because the communication is difficult, to say the least.
That wonderful trope of, no plan lasts contact with the enemy. But I think, coming back to Mark McCaffrey's point earlier, the Alexander image of the rash, impetuous Alexander, headstrong, by Gaugamela, those traits are supposedly worse. And yet, when he's asked to come back, he comes back. If you have a headstrong, impetuous Alexander who's going to do what he does, regardless of the risks, he's not coming back. He's going after Darius. So I think that you've got the picture painted at Gaugamela is a dramatic one, but the reality is Alexander was always going to come back and support his army. He wasn't going to pursue Darius. He was pursuing Darius, and when he's told, no, you need to make sure that the army is not cut off, he's not torn. That's the dramatic picture of Alexander the headstrong that we're given in the sources. But the reality is, yes, without your army, you're nothing. You know this. He knows that. He goes back and saves the army. So I think that, again, that picture at Granicus of the rash Alexander charging, and, and I think in Plutarch, he charges without infantry support. It's like, no. But speculation, we were talking about that earlier. How far it's too far. If Alexander dies at Issus, for instance, most of the people who on his deathbed fight over the new, Alexandrian Empire are there. They are present in the army because those are the men who take over. Perdiccas is there. Several others who die later, Coinus, Clytus are there. Hephaestion is there. Who's going to take over? You've got the Alexander Lycestis, but you've also got the men who are essentially, and Alexander, presumably, if we accept the source that Alexander's, preferment of the strongest, who's it going to be? Are they going, on the field of Issus fighting out who's going to take over?
But that's an interesting. It's close enough that we mentioned before that Philip's done a lot to bring Macedon together and to nullify the previous dynastic houses of Upper Macedon and whatnot. I think Issus is an interesting point to sort of ask that question, because is it closer to those houses having been brought under the umbrella of Macedon, or is it closer to, as you mentioned, a lot of the people who are the successors later on? Have they had enough time to actually develop the personalities and the identities that they later bank when they become the successor leaders later on? It's sort of half and half, really.
They've only had a year of success in Asia. They haven't had a decade of success in Asia, so they're possibly not quite that. But certainly talking about, look what I did there, Jasper. Look at that segue to the second question.
Yes, the second question being, what if Alexander had died in 323? Would his empire have been as military sustainable as the Persians had been? Are we going to first have a sidebar about the sustainability of the Persian Empire? And that was David's question. So who wants to try and deal with that one?
I think that all depends upon where Alexander went next, because if you read the sources, they say that he had plans to go conquer other territories, whether Arabia, or he was thinking maybe about Carthage. And there's speculation. I remember that in reading my Livy that what if Alexander had gone to Italy, and had Alexander gone westward and been fighting well into the next decade, he would have been older. He was already badly wounded. He was probably down. He probably only had one functional lung left. He was suffering from severe effects of drinking and what have you. So physically and possibly mentally, he wouldn't have been what he once was. That being said, reduced Alexander is still probably a better general than almost anybody else he's going to come across. On the other hand, he's going westward, and we see that the first territories that would split away from the successors were the ones in the distant east. That is, there was been Bactria, and there would have been the Indian territories, which still we would say under Macedonian control, Greek control, but they probably would have, if he was far away, been very hard to keep together. I think as long as Alexander was the king, they probably would have at least been nominally under his control. It would have been hard to keep them together the further and further he went, but probably would have stayed loyal. The question is, what happens to Alexander? If I could just pause it with regard to what Livy would always said, eventually he's going to keep fighting, and he'll become not simply, he'll be a middle-aged man and older, not what he once was. Could there have been some sort of civil war to challenge him? Who knows?
I think you've got to take into consideration that already within Alexander's lifetime, though, there had already been problems in the east in terms of rebellions by garrisons that he'd left in Bactria and whatnot, and he'd had to leave a couple of his phalanx commanders back behind as he'd advanced into India to actually take care of some of these potential rebels as such. They bring about a settlement, but then the same area erupts into rebellion soon after his death, and you've got Perdiccas having to send a detachment over there. It's with who's it, Phaethon? No, can't think of who he's. I think it is who he sends over to actually deal with the mercenary garrisons, as they're labelled at that time. But already you've got those problems, and I think at the same time, Alexander, with all of his conquest, he doesn't really do much in terms of bringing any change to the Persian system of the satrapies, and so subsequently he's not as wonderful as he is in terms of conquering. He isn't a proven great administrator, certainly not like his father. And okay, he goes much further than his father, but in terms of longevity, I think it would have been very much up in the air as to how long his administrative system would have held together and actually sustained a conqueror who wanted to go and add more rather than administer what he's got.
I think he's also aware that his army works best when it's working. And he, later emperors, later kings and emperors do that too. Even, Julius Caesar is planning a Parthian campaign on his death. And I mean, that's the other thing is, Alexander's dead at 33. Julius Caesar is 56 when he dies. So, saying that Alexander would be a middle-aged man, 56 is old for the time, but not old, really. Antigonus is 81, still on the battlefield. So that idea that he could keep fighting, and even a lesser Alexander is still a better general than any general around. So I think if he had pushed forward and kept fighting, he's, talking of building a phalanx out of Persians, he's going to replenish, and he's therefore got a manpower base to have satraps and commanders to, yes, have little kingdoms of their own within the Alexandrian Empire. But I think if he turns to the Balkans, if he turns to against Carthage, if he turns to Syria, to Sicily and then Italy, the Carthaginians of the time, the Romans of the time, the Balkan states of the time, they aren't going to be able to stand against him because they're not the states that they are later. Alexander against the not even the Romans at the time in the Sabines, the Samnites, the Latin League, then the Romans. Those are not empires that can oppose Alexander. And the tactics that he's tried and true in Persia to bring them onto his side, he's going to try again in Italy and in Carthage, and it's.
But do you need an empire like a great army to bring him down? Because I get, I always get the feeling that Alexander is just, as I said before, he's a cult of individual, and he's not like an Augustus who, yes, Augustus fosters the cult of the individual, but at the same time he's got a trusted sidekick in the form of Agrippa, who can also go around and fight spot fires as they come around and be at the opposite end of the empire to where he's dealing with. And Alexander, as much as he, and again, we suffer from our sources not telling us as much about, these separate campaigns that are sent off, like, for example, in Bactria and Sogdiana, or, for example, we mentioned already Parmenion, his advancement into Asia. Also, he's acting separately when Alexander is sort of moving across the central plateau of Asia Minor. But Alexander, I don't know if he really is the sort of guy who is going to delegate authority to such an extent that he's not going to be a micromanager in the end and be wanting to, be everywhere to everyone. And that's going to end up not being manageable.
You mean because the empire is only where he is?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think he would have pushed forward until he was defeated. And I think the thing is, he defeats himself eventually. But the reality would be that militarily, if he was pushing forward, who's going to stop him? And then you've got that issue, as the Romans later had, of you've now got this vast empire that you can't administrate. And, as we say, he's not really a proven administrator. He just adopts the satrapies and just appoints new people to the satrapies. But again, all of the people who take over after Alexander are around. And if we're to trust Perdiccas's version, because only he was there, is he going to be the man who is the delegate when Alexander's not present? He's, ruling the East while Alexander is off conquering the West? We don't know. He's by that point, he's got an heir. He's got wives who are pregnant. Again, if he'd lived just a little bit longer, there would have been more heirs because they're pregnant when he dies. So, coulda, shoulda, woulda. Lovely historical fiction.
That seems the case of On That Bombshell, or not. Thank you, Mark, and Murray. I think for all of us, it's going to be happy holidays, Christmas, and happy New Year before we speak to you again, unless you're listening to the Ancient Warfare Answers, because that keeps going on and on and on forever because the questions don't stop.
They don't.
Seems like. I'll see you again soon in 2024. Bye-bye.